Welcome back. In part one, we established that the combination of an environment that varied seasonally and the importance of timing key events to coincide with the most favorable environmental conditions determined why birds do things when they do. Add to this the need for important events not to overlap with one another, and you end up with the annual cycle that we observed. All three of these points are needed to fully answer the question of why birds breed when they do, or molt when they do, or migrate when they do. We need that seasonal variation in the environment. We need that selective force pushing individuals to time key events to be at an optimal time. And we have that need to separate other challenging events so that, for example, birds aren't trying to molt and breed at the same time, or molt and migrate. Now we move on to the second question. If it's important for the events to occur at the right time, how do birds manage to do that? After all, they don't carry little calendars with them telling them that spring is on the way, so they should get ready to breed. Instead, there must be some sort of cue that tells the birds that it's time to, for example, breed or molt or migrate. An obvious candidate for this cue is that it's the variation in the environment that birds are actually trying to match. That is, temperature or food supply. We'd refer to these as ultimate cues, that trying to time events based on changes that you're actually trying to match. And at some level, this may play a role in determining when birds are doing various things. For example, earlier I showed you this example for tree swallows breeding in New York, where the timing of breeding was directly related to temperature, which made sense because the food supply for these species is insects that are flying up in the air column. That only occurs when it's warm enough, and there is some evidence here then that the birds are responding to that ultimate cue, the temperature that determines food supply. But that's got some problems. If we go back to this graph and look at the tree swallows, or most of these other species, we see that breeding actually starts well in advance of the environment becoming favorable. It's even more dramatic in the case, say, of Eleanor's falcon or the boreal owl, where they're timing the fledgling period to the peak in food supply. They can't be waiting for conditions to improve before starting to breed, because otherwise those good conditions are going to end before they get to the difficult stage in the reproductive cycle. You can think of the same thing in terms of, say, migration south. If you wait until winter really comes to start your migration, you might freeze to death. Even worse, think about the northward migration, where, say, you're a bird spending the winter in Costa Rica, where conditions are great all year long. How do you know when to migrate north? There has to be some other type of cue out there. Now, before I move on, there are exceptions. I said we'd get back to the red-billed quelea on this graph, where in this case, conditions are improving before breeding starts. Now the key here is understanding the ecology of this species. Quelea live in southern Africa in very arid areas where the environment varies, but it varies unpredictably. And in this case, it's rain that's unpredictable. They live in arid areas. They don't know exactly when the rain is going to come any given year. And so breeding is determined by a sequence of ultimate cues. It starts to rain, and the birds respond to that. They start to get into breeding condition. After it rains, food becomes available, and the birds start to breed. Now that comes at some cost, that the peak in food supply is actually pretty early in the breeding season. But because of the change is unpredictable, it would be even worse if the birds started to breed and the rains didn't come in a given year. In most cases, though, the species are starting to undertake these events before the ultimate environmental variables become favorable. Instead, they need what we call approximate Q. Approximate Q is a Q that's not directly related to the seasonal variation that you're trying to track, but it's an indicator that the one that you're ultimately interested in is coming. With proximate cues, then, what we come back to is, in order to understand how birds are managing to time these events, in fact, they do need to have some sort of calendar with them in order to tell them that, yes, spring is coming, you better migrate, you better get ready to breed. Now the question becomes, what's the nature of this calendar that birds are using to determine when to do things like breed or migrate? One hypothesis is that it's built in, that this is something we would refer to as an endogenous calendar, or more precisely, the presence of endogenous rhythms. That, thinking back to that circular annual cycle of the mallard, that there's just this built-in rhythm of molt, migrate, pair bond, migrate, breed, molt, etc. And it's an entirely internal process. This hypothesis predicts that the events will occur at the right time, even when there's no environmental cues present at all. Now, the next question is, how do you test something like this? We can't remove cues for wild birds, otherwise they're removed from their environment. What we can do, however, is keep birds in captivity. Then, when they're in captivity, we can keep them under a perfectly constant environment. The same food, the same temperature, etc., day after day after day, to ensure that they don't have the presence of any environmental cues to tell them what time of year it is. Now, the drawback of this is, of course, they can't migrate, etc. So we have to look for surrogates for these annual cycle events, and that's what we do. In this case, these are data from 3 years studying a bird called a garden warbler. Garden warblers are European, and they've been studied quite a bit in ornithology. We'll hear about them again. And what we see are these birds that were kept under constant condition underwent an annual cycle. So starting at the bottom, the years here, we've got months of year 1, then start January year 2, January year 3, and so forth. Normally these birds molt twice a year in summer and then winter. Remember those pre-basic and pre-alternate molts. And what we can see is this bird with no environmental cues molted as expected in summer, and then come next winter and molted again, molted in summer, winter, summer. No environmental cues, but a cycle. Body mass in birds typically fluctuates on an annual basis. And again, the next graph up shows fluctuations in body mass over time. So that looking here in year 2, body mass increases in the spring before birds, for example, start to migrate north. In the fall, we again see a peak in body mass as the birds prepare to migrate south. So body mass is cycling. And another indication of being motivated to migrate is something called Zugenruhe. This is a German term that means literally migratory restlessness, and it's something that's measured in studies of migration you're going to hear about next time. Again, there's a pattern there where if you look here in year 2, we've got peaks in that desire to migrate at this given time. We can also study the readiness for breeding in the wild, or in the captive birds that aren't exposed to any environmental cues. And one way this is done is looking at changes in the bird's gonads over time. Now, birds have internal testes and ovaries, and what's different about them, at least from our perspective, is that the size of these organs changes dramatically over the course of a year. If, for example, you look at the internal testes of a male, what this is showing is the cloaca, the opening, the vas deferens that carry the sperm to the opening. We've got kidneys, and then these very small testes during the non-breeding season. If you look inside a bird during the breeding season, there's something dramatically different. Those testes increase dramatically in size and become huge relative to the non-breeding season. Same thing happens to the ovaries of female birds. And the idea here is you've got flying birds where mass is important. Why carry around that extra mass of enlarged gonads for 10 months out of the year when you're not using them? So we can look at the readiness to breed by looking at how these gonads are enlarging in preparation to breed. And going back to our garden warbler example, that's this top graph, where in this case the testes are during the non-breeding season only about 1 millimeter long, but that here in the spring of the second year they're about 6 millimeters long, regress again in the non-breeding season, and then enlarge. So changes, this annual cycle, in the absence of any environmental cues whatsoever. So what these and similar experiments show is that these endogenous rhythms do exist. And more specifically, these are rhythms of a given period, that they're annual, or as I'll show in a minute, approximately annual. Circa means about annual, so we refer to circannual endogenous rhythms in talking about this pattern. Figure 9-7 in your reading from Gill's Ornithology book shows examples of some similar experiments. He shows in the top panel of that figure, for example, data on European starlings, a bird you're familiar with here, kept for 4 years, showing the black bars with that once a year molt that occurs, and then the dots and lines showing, again, that annual change in testis length, where we go from testes that are about 2 millimeters wide in the non-breeding season to 5 times bigger in the breeding season. So again, annual cycle, but notice it's not exactly perfect. There's a little variation there from year to year. This becomes more clear in the bottom part of that panel, where data from 2 species, the garden warbler again, and then the Eurasian blackcap are shown. And the data here are limited to the molt, but the birds were kept for 8 years in this case under constant environmental conditions. The black bars represent that summer molt occurring, and at the beginning for both species it occurs about when it belongs in midsummer. And then the open bars are that winter molt occurring at the end of the year, about where it begins. But here, notice something else is happening. As the years go by, the timing of these events starts to drift for both species, so that by the time we get to, say, the 4th year or the 5th year, that summer molt is occurring in January in the warbler. And by the time we get down to the year 6, the summer molt in the blackcap is occurring in January. So we've got a general cycle here, but it's circannual. And in fact, if you look carefully, the period of this cycle is actually 10 months, not 12 months. So we've got a calendar, but in no way is this calendar sufficient for timing things precisely as it needs to be. And instead, we need to somehow set that calendar to make sure it's more precise, or the specific terminology is the endogenous calendar needs to be entrained to make it more precise. And Gill talks about this process on pages 250 to 255 of your reading. All right, with that challenge, I think this is a good place to pause again, and we'll go on to part 3 of this lecture, where we'll wrap this up. So again, return to Blackboard and look for the link to part 3 on YouTube.